welcome to Scary Stories to fall asleep to. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Now, for the best experience, turn the lights off, get comfy, and relax.
Story number 1. The Frozen Heart of Greed. Have you ever felt a hunger that gnaws not at your stomach, but at something deeper, a void that no earthly sustenance can ever truly fill? What happens when the pristine light of winter's embrace turns treacherous, and the cold seeps into the very marrow of your being, chilling not just the land, but the delicate balance of the human spirit? Are the tales whispered around crackling fires the stories of ancient beings and insatiable hungers, clearly fantastical narratives meant to keep children from straying into the darkening woods? Or do they serve as echoes of a profound and terrifying truth, a reality we collectively choose to ignore until it is far too late? The small community of Havenwood nestled on the edge of a vast, untamed expanse of Blackwood National Forest. Towering pines and ancient hemlocks cast long skeletal shadows even under the midday sun, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. The air, often crisp and carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, held an undercurrent of something else, something indefinable yet undeniably present, a subtle disquiet that clung to the inhabitants like the persistent morning mist. To the west, the jagged peaks of the Whisperwind Mountains clawed at the sky, their snow-capped summits often obscured by swirling clouds, adding to the sense of isolation that permeated Havenwood. The nearest town of any significant size lay a grueling 6-hour drive away, over winding roads that snaked through the dense forest, further emphasizing the community's detachment from the outside world. This remoteness fostered a sense of self-reliance, but also a certain insularity, a tendency for the residents to keep their own counsel and regard outsiders with a mixture of polite curiosity and deep-seated suspicion. Elias Thorne, a wildlife photographer with a penchant for the melancholic beauty of desolate landscapes, was drawn to Havenwood by the allure of capturing the elusive wildlife said to roam the Blackwood. He was an outsider, a recent arrival seeking solace and inspiration in the quiet solitude of the forest. His past was a tapestry woven with threads of loss, and a yearning for connection that he hoped to find mirrored in the raw, untamed heart of nature. Sarah Jenkins, a local historian and descendant of one of Havenwood's founding families, carried the weight of generations of stories within her. A quiet, observant woman with a deep respect for the land and its history, she had always felt an unspoken connection to the folklore passed down through her ancestors. Tales often dismissed by the more pragmatic members of the community as quaint superstitions. A shared sense of unease, a subtle dissonance in the familiar rhythms of Havenwood, drew Elias and Sarah together, their paths intertwining amidst the growing shadows. The first signs were almost imperceptible, easily dismissed as tricks of the wind or the overactive imaginations of those living in such close proximity to the wilderness. A fleeting glimpse of an unnaturally tall, gaunt figure moving silently at the edge of the woods. A series of guttural howls that seemed to echo something ancient and hungry. The inexplicable disappearance of livestock from even the most secure barns. These incidents, initially isolated and attributed to wild animals or fatigue, began to coalesce into a pattern of unsettling strangeness. A palpable anxiety began to ripple through Havenwood, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, a prickling sensation on the back of the neck, even in the warmth of their homes. The laughter of children playing in the woods seemed to fade quicker, and the nightly routines of the community took on a hurried, almost fearful quality. Doors were bolted earlier, and the comforting glow of porch lights seemed to burn a little brighter, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. Whispers began to circulate, hushed conversations in the dimly lit corners of the local diner and furtive exchanges between neighbors over fences. The old stories, the legends of a malevolent entity tied to the very fabric of the Blackwood, started to resurface. Tales of a creature born of winter's cruelty and the darkest aspects of human nature. A being with an insatiable hunger that could never be satisfied. These were the stories of the Wendigo, a figure from Algonquian mythology, a monstrous being driven by an unending greed and a craving for human flesh. The legend spoke of a transformation, a descent from humanity into something monstrous, fueled by acts of desperation and a chilling disregard for the well-being of others. Some dismissed these tales as nothing more than folklore, remnants of a time when fear and superstition held sway. Others, their faces etched with a growing dread, wondered if these ancient warnings were beginning to stir from their long slumber, awakened by something they could not yet comprehend. As the days bled into weeks, the subtle unease in Havenwood intensified, morphing into a palpable dread that hung heavy in the air. Elias found his photographic pursuits increasingly hampered by annoying anxiety, the beauty of the forest now tinged with a sense of foreboding. His nights were plagued by vivid nightmares, fragmented images of skeletal figures moving through snow-covered landscapes, their eyes burning with a cold, inhuman hunger. During the day, he would often catch himself staring into the dense woods, convinced he had seen something move just beyond the periphery of his vision, a fleeting shadow that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Sarah, too, felt the growing weight of the unsettling atmosphere. The stories she had always found fascinating now took on a sinister edge, the warnings of her ancestors echoing in her mind with increasing urgency. She found herself poring over old journals and tribal histories, seeking answers in the faded ink and brittle pages, a growing sense of responsibility settling upon her as the unsettling events mirrored the ancient lore. The isolation of Havenwood, once a comforting embrace, now felt like a suffocating shroud. The close-knit community began to fray at the edges, suspicion and distrust creeping into their interactions. Neighbors who had shared decades of camaraderie now eyed each other with a hesitant uncertainty, the shared anxiety creating invisible walls between them. Communication became strained, conversations punctuated by nervous glances and unspoken fears. Elias, being the newcomer, felt the brunt of this growing paranoia, his presence viewed with increasing suspicion by some of the more long-standing residents. Sarah, though a local, found herself increasingly isolated as she delved deeper into the unsettling folklore. Her attempts to share her findings often met with skepticism or outright dismissal. A sense of being alone in the face of an unseen threat began to weigh heavily on them both, amplifying their vulnerability to the encroaching darkness. The very legends that might offer an explanation, a way to understand the horror unfolding around them, were becoming a source of further division and fear. Driven by a need to understand the escalating strangeness, Elias and Sarah began to actively research the local folklore, their individual anxieties fueling a shared quest for answers. Sarah unearthed chilling accounts of the Wendigo in her family's archives and local historical society records, detailing its origins as a human transformed by starvation-induced cannibalism or possession by a malevolent spirit. The transformation was described as a gradual process, marked by increasing selfishness, violence, hunger, and a particular craving for human flesh. Elias, through his photography contacts and online research, discovered similar legends among various Algonquian-speaking tribes, each with slight variations in the creature as appearance and the specific circumstances of its transformation. Some traditions depicted the Wendigo as a gaunt giant with a heart of ice, while others described it as a more spectral entity, a manifestation of winter as cruelty and human excess. They learned that these stories often served as cautionary tales, reinforcing the taboo against cannibalism and highlighting the dangers of greed and isolation. The moral lessons embedded within the folklore spoke of the importance of community and the devastating consequences of prioritizing self-preservation above all else. The late Native American scholar Dr. Jack D. Forbes' work, Columbus and Other Cannibals, used the Wendigo as a metaphor for the destructive nature of exploitation and imperialism, suggesting that the true horror might lie in the societal patterns of violence and greed that we struggle to recognize. As Elias and Sarah delved deeper, unsettling dreams and visions began to plague them with increasing intensity, blurring the already fragile line between the waking world and the realm of nightmares. Elias would often awaken in a cold sweat, the chilling image of a towering, emaciated figure with glowing eyes burned into his mind. He would hear whispers in the darkness, a faint, whistling sound that seemed to echo the descriptions of the Wendigo found in the old texts. Sarah's dreams were filled with fragmented visions of the community's past, glimpses of harsh winters and desperate choices, shadowy figures moving through the snow-laden woods. She saw faces contorted in hunger and fear, their eyes reflecting a terrible, all-consuming need. These nocturnal terrors left them both feeling increasingly disoriented and questioning their own sanity. The vividness of the dreams, their unsettling connection to the folklore they were researching, suggested that something ancient and malevolent was beginning to stir not just in the forest, but within the very fabric of their minds. The boundary between the stories and their reality was dissolving, leaving them adrift in a sea of uncertainty and dread. The unsettling events in Havenwood escalated with chilling rapidity. The initial, subtle occurrences gave way to more overt and terrifying manifestations. The gaunt figure Elias had glimpsed at the edge of the woods was now seen more frequently, its emaciated form and unnaturally long limbs unmistakable. Its presence brought with it an oppressive cold, a bone-chilling stillness that silenced the forest and filled the air with a palpable sense of dread. The howls became louder, closer, carrying a distinct, chillingly human-like quality that sent shivers down the spines of those who heard them. The sense of being watched intensified, no longer a fleeting feeling but a constant, unnerving awareness of unseen eyes upon them. Physical evidence began to surface, strange, oversized tracks in the snow, the mangled remains of deer and other wildlife, their carcasses stripped bare as if by an unnatural hunger. The psychological impact on the community was devastating, fear becoming a dominant emotion, eroding trust and fostering a climate of paranoia. Both Elias and Sarah began to notice disturbing changes within themselves. Elias, usually a man of quiet contemplation, found himself increasingly irritable and prone to fits of anger. An unfamiliar hunger began to gnaw at him, a craving for rich, fatty foods that seemed insatiable. He became withdrawn, isolating himself further as his thoughts grew darker and more obsessive. Sarah, normally grounded and rational, experienced vivid hallucinations, fleeting glimpses of grotesque figures in the periphery of her vision. She felt a growing paranoia, a sense that everyone around her was somehow involved in the unfolding horror, their polite smiles masking sinister intentions. Their internal struggles mirrored the very folklore they were studying. The early stages of the Wendigo's transformation described as increasing selfishness, violence, and an insatiable hunger. The line between observer and observed, between the subject of their research and their own terrifying reality, began to blur with alarming speed. The escalating horror did not leave the wider community untouched. Fear, like a contagion, spread through Havenwood, fracturing the once cohesive social fabric. Suspicion fell upon anyone acting remotely unusual, long-held grudges resurfaced, and the potential for the community to turn on itself grew with each passing day. Some residents, gripped by panic, spoke of leaving Havenwood, abandoning their homes and lives in a desperate attempt to escape the encroaching darkness. Others, fueled by fear and a desperate need for control, began to consider extreme measures their conversations taking on a grim and unsettling tone. The universal revulsion towards the Wendigo, a sentiment deeply ingrained in the folklore, began to manifest as a dangerous paranoia, a willingness to suspect and even harm those perceived as potential threats. The very essence of community, the bonds of trust and mutual support that had once defined Heavenwood, was dissolving under the relentless pressure of an unseen and terrifying enemy. The feeling of powerlessness became a crushing weight upon Elias and Sarah. Their attempts to understand and combat the horror seemed futile, each new piece of information only deepening their sense of dread. Escape seemed an increasingly distant possibility, the vast expanse of the Blackwood Forest now feeling less like a sanctuary and more like an inescapable trap. Failed attempts to contact the outside world, intermittent phone service, and a sense of being cut off from any meaningful assistance only amplified their desperation. A primal fear began to take hold, a visceral understanding of their vulnerability in the face of something ancient and utterly beyond their control. The slow, deliberate increase in tension had reached a breaking point, the anticipation of the unknown now overshadowed by the terrifying certainty of an imminent and deadly confrontation. The confrontation arrived on a night shrouded in an unnatural silence. The wind, which usually whispered through the pines, was still. The moon, a sliver in the inky sky, offered little illumination. A blood-curdling scream pierced the stillness, echoing through the deserted streets of Havenwood. Drawn by a morbid curiosity and a desperate hope of helping, Elias and Sarah found themselves facing the embodiment of the folklore they had so diligently researched. Standing at the edge of the woods, bathed in the faint moonlight, was a figure that defied human comprehension. It was tall, impossibly so, its emaciated frame barely concealed by a tattered cloak of shadows. Antlers, like the gnarled branches of a dead tree, sprouted from its gaunt head, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent yellow light. The air around it crackled with an icy energy, and a chilling, whistling sound emanated from its unseen mouth. The Wendigo. Its presence radiated a primal terror, a sense of ancient hunger and cold that seemed to seep into their very souls. This was not just a monster from a story. It was a living nightmare, a manifestation of the darkest fears of generations. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming, their minds struggling to reconcile the fantastical creature before them with the reality of their situation. Even amidst the paralyzing fear, the psychological battle raged within Elias and Sarah. The stories they had read, the warnings they had dismissed as folklore, now screamed with terrifying relevance. The Wendigo represented not just a physical threat, but a spiritual and psychological corruption, a being born of greed and a loss of empathy. The existential dread was profound, the realization that they were facing something that defied the natural order, something that preyed not just on the body, but on the very essence of humanity. Their sanity felt fragile, the line between fear and madness threatening to dissolve entirely. In a desperate attempt to survive, Elias, driven by a surge of adrenaline, raised his camera, the flash momentarily illuminating the creature's grotesque features. Sarah, remembering a passage from one of the ancient texts, frantically searched her pockets for a small, silver amulet, a protective charm said to ward off evil spirits. Their actions, though born of desperation, felt woefully inadequate against the overwhelming presence of the ancient horror before them. In the face of such unimaginable terror, the boundaries of morality began to fray. A desperate thought flickered through Elias's mind, a chilling echo of the Wendigo's origins. A small, isolated cabin stood a few miles into the woods, occupied by a recluse known for his volatile temper and self-imposed exile from the community. The image of the man, alone and vulnerable, flashed before Elias's eyes, a horrifyingly pragmatic calculation taking root in his fear-addled brain. Sarah, witnessing Elias's sudden shift in demeanor, felt a cold dread grip her heart. Had the encroaching darkness begun to corrupt him as well, twisting his desperation into something truly monstrous? The line between survival and succumbing to the very evil they fought blurred, the ancient taboo against prioritizing self above all else threatening to shatter. The Wendigo lunged, its movements disturbingly swift despite its emaciated appearance. Elias stumbled backward, his camera clattering to the ground. Sarah cried out, the silver amulet slipping from her trembling fingers. Just as the creature's shadow fell upon them, a piercing shriek echoed from the woods, not the cry of a human, but something else. Something ancient and filled with an unbearable sorrow. The Wendigo faltered, its glowing eyes momentarily losing their intense focus. And then the ground beneath them began to tremble. The twist came not from the shadows, but from the very earth beneath their feet. The shriek was not a sound of terror, but of anguish, a lament that resonated with the ancient trees and the very stones of the mountains. The Wendigo, the monstrous embodiment of greed and hunger, was not the true horror. It was a symptom. As the ground bucked and split, a colossal form began to rise from the depths of the blackwood, a being of immense power and sorrow, its very presence radiating a profound grief. This was the land itself, Mother Earth, wounded and enraged by the relentless exploitation and disregard of generations. The Wendigo, in its insatiable hunger, was merely a manifestation of this pain, a desperate attempt by the ravaged Earth to purge itself of the parasitic greed that had festered within it. The haunting revelation was that the true monster was not a creature of folklore, but the collective human disregard for the delicate balance of nature, a primal fear realized in the Earth's agonizing cry. Elias and Sarah, caught between the enraged Earth and its tormented manifestation, were left to question not just the reality of the legends, but the very foundation of their existence. The unsettling truth was that the frozen heart of greed had not just chilled the land, but had awakened a force far more ancient and terrifying than any whispered tale. Story number 2. The Pallid Slumber. Have you ever slept in a room where someone took their last breath? What echoes linger in the silence of a place built to house both the living and the dead? Can the anonymity of a hotel truly erase the history etched into its very stones, especially when that history involves the finality of human existence? Does the boundary between hospitality and the cold reality of death ever truly fade in a building that has served as both a temporary home and a final destination? What kind of dreams might take root in the stillness of a room that once lay adjacent to the silent slumber of the departed? Arthur Finch, a writer whose mind often wandered into the shadowed corners of history, found himself standing before the Grandview Hotel. Its facade, once undoubtedly a testament to opulence, now bore the subtle marks of time's relentless passage. Gilded flourishes were tarnished, and the once vibrant awnings were faded, yet an undeniable air of grandeur still clung to the building like a persistent memory. Arthur, drawn by whispers of the hotel's past, checked in with a polite but somewhat distant clerk. He had come to research the Grandview's rumored service as a temporary naval medical facility during the mid-20th century. His fascination with the darker threads of history, those often overlooked or intentionally obscured, had led him to this place, a place where temporary respite might have once given way to the permanent stillness of death. The hotel's present elegance, though palpable, seemed to overlay a deeper, more utilitarian history, a palimpsest of eras etched into its very structure. As Arthur settled into his room on the 3rd floor, a subtle unease began to weave its way into his awareness. In the long corridors, despite the faint hum of the building's modern systems, a persistent, almost clinical scent lingered, reminiscent of antiseptic. It was an unexpected aroma in a place dedicated to leisure, a ghostly reminder of a different purpose the hotel might have once served. In certain areas, particularly as he ventured towards the lower levels, a distinct drop in temperature could be felt, a sudden chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. He learned from a turf sign that the basement was off limits to guests, a detail that only piqued his curiosity further. Late at night, when the hotel fell into a deeper silence, Arthur began to notice faint sounds, the almost imperceptible drag of something heavy across the floor above, or perhaps the muffled cadence of hushed whispers that seemed to drift just beyond the threshold of hearing. When he attempted to inquire about the hotel as history beyond its current iteration, the staff offered only practiced smiles and pointed towards brochures highlighting its architectural merits and recent renovations. They seemed hesitant to delve into any narratives that strayed from the hotel's carefully curated image of contemporary elegance. This reluctance only strengthened Arthur's suspicion that the Grandview held secrets beneath its polished veneer. The atmosphere of the Grandview began to seep into Arthur's subconscious. His nights were increasingly troubled by vivid and disturbing dreams. He found himself navigating sterile, white-tiled rooms, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. Cold metal tables gleamed under harsh, unforgiving light, and shrouded figures moved silently in the periphery of his vision, their purpose unclear, but their presence undeniably ominous. During his waking hours, a growing sense of being watched settled upon him, a prickling sensation that intensified in the hotel's long, often deserted corridors. He would often glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see something, just out of sight. The hotel itself seemed sparsely populated. He rarely encountered other guests, and the staff, while always polite, maintained a careful distance, their interactions brief and impersonal. This growing isolation amplified his unease, fostering a sense of vulnerability within the grand but strangely empty building. Simultaneously, Arthur's attempts to uncover the truth about the hotel's past met with frustratingly little success. Official records of the Naval Hospital seemed fragmented, incomplete, or simply missing from public archives. Each dead end fueled his suspicion, suggesting a deliberate effort to bury a potentially unsettling history. Driven by the increasingly vivid nightmares and the pervasive sense of dread that clung to him like a shroud, Arthur resolved to delve deeper into the Grandview's hidden past. He spent hours poring over old city directories and historical society records, eventually uncovering a vague reference to a significant but temporary medical facility housed within the Grandview during the Second World War. This small breakthrough spurred him to explore the hotel more thoroughly. He managed to subtly question a long-serving maintenance worker, whose hesitant recollections hinted at forgotten spaces within the building. Following these vague leads, Arthur eventually discovered a hidden dusty archive tucked away in the hotel's sub-basement. The air in the archive was thick with the smell of aged paper and undisturbed dust. Within the dimly lit space, Arthur found stacks of old blueprints, their lines faded but still discernible. Among them, he located plans for the Grandview dating back to the 1940s. His breath caught in his throat as he traced a section clearly labeled Naval Infirmary, Morgue, and Crematorium. Alongside the blueprints were boxes filled with old photographs. Stark, black and white images depicted utilitarian rooms equipped with cold, metallic tables, instruments of surgical precision, and what appeared to be a large, ominous incinerator. The equipment was unmistakably medical and funereal in its nature. Further searching revealed a faded logbook, its pages brittle with age. It detailed patient admissions and deaths during the naval occupation, the entries stark and clinical. The surprisingly high mortality rate, marked by a seemingly endless list of names and dates, painted a grim picture of the Grandview's wartime role. Armed with the concrete knowledge of the hotel's past, A profound sense of dread settled over Arthur. The subtle occurrences he had dismissed as mere imagination now took on a sinister significance. He felt an almost irresistible pull back to the basement, a sense that the truth he sought was not fully revealed. Late one night, drawn by an inexplicable sound, a faint, rhythmic dripping that echoed in the stillness, he descended the creaking stairs to the sub-basement. He found a door, one he had previously noticed was locked and bolted, now standing slightly ajar. A sliver of cold, stale air escaped from the opening, carrying with it the unmistakable, overpowering scent of antiseptic. Hesitantly, Arthur pushed the door further open and stepped inside. The room was plunged in near darkness, the only illumination coming from the weak glow of his phone screen. As his eyes slowly adjusted, he made out rows upon rows of narrow beds, their frames rusted with age. Initially, they appeared empty, but as he focused, he noticed subtle indentations on the thin mattresses, faint outlines that suggested recent occupancy. The air grew intensely cold, a bone-chilling dampness that seeped into his clothes. Then, a whisper, seemingly originating from everywhere and nowhere at once, brushed against his ear, sending a shiver down his spine. "Welcome home." The chilling realization washed over Arthur with the force of a tidal wave. The Grandview was not just a former morgue, it was still functioning as one. But the residents were not the living. They were the echoes of those who had died within its walls during its time as a naval medical facility, their spectral forms trapped in a liminal state, forever resting in their temporary wartime abode. Arthur, with his morbid fascination, had unknowingly checked into his own final destination. The cold no longer felt like a warning. It felt like an embrace. And in the silence, Arthur thought he heard another whisper, soft as a breath, joining the chorus. Rest now. Story number 3. From Within, Not Without. The old house stood on a slight rise overlooking the town, its darkened windows like vacant eyes, staring into the perpetual twilight that seemed to cling to the valley. A silence, thick and expectant, always preceded the first tremor. It wasn't a natural quiet, the kind that settles after a snowfall or before a storm. This was an absence, a void where the usual tapestry of sound, the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of unseen birds, should have been. It was in this unnerving stillness that Eleanor first noticed the absence of something she couldn't quite name, a subtle wrongness in the auditory landscape of her new home. The house had been an impulse buy, a desperate attempt to outrun the suffocating memories of her past. Nestled away from the city's relentless clamor, she had hoped to find solace within its aged walls. Yet, from the moment she unpacked the last box, disquiet had taken root, growing with each passing day. It wasn't the creaking floorboards or the whisper of the wind through the eaves that bothered her. It was the silence, the pregnant pause before the unsettling sensation began. It started as a faint pressure in her ears, a subtle tightening behind her eyes, as if some immense, inaudible force was bearing down on her. Then came the whispers. Not actual words, not sounds carried on the air, but a feeling, a resonance within the deepest recesses of her mind. They were fleeting at first, like half-born thoughts struggling to surface, leaving behind only a residue of unease. But as the days bled into weeks, the whispers grew stronger, coalescing into something more defined, more disturbing. They felt like screams, raw and visceral, yet utterly silent, existing only within the confines of her own perception. Eleanor tried to rationalize it. The stress of the move, the lingering grief over her loss, surely these were playing tricks on her mind. Psychological horror often manifests through such internal anxieties, preying on mental and emotional states like anxiety and disturbed perceptions. She told herself it was her imagination running wild in the oppressive silence of the old house. But the feeling persisted, a constant, low-level hum of silent terror that kept her perpetually on edge. The house itself seemed to amplify her growing unease. Its shadowed corners and long, echoing hallways fostered a sense of isolation. Even in the bright light of day, a certain coldness permeated the air, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The invisible screams, as she had begun to think of them, seemed to emanate from the very structure of the building, as if the house itself was trying to communicate some unspeakable horror. As the silent screams intensified, Eleanor found herself increasingly isolated, both physically and emotionally. She had no neighbors close by, and her attempts to explain her experiences to the few acquaintances she had made in town were met with polite skepticism or thinly veiled concern. The intangible nature of her torment made it impossible to share, creating a growing chasm between her perception of reality and that of others. This isolation fueled her paranoia, making her question her own sanity. Was she truly hearing these silent screams, or was her mind finally succumbing to the weight of her past? The line between external threat and internal breakdown began to blur, a hallmark of psychological horror where the audience, along with the protagonist, questions the reliability of the narrative. The pressure in her ears became a constant companion, a prelude to the silent onslaught. The screams themselves varied in intensity and tone. Some were sharp and sudden, like a jolt of pure terror, leaving her breathless and trembling. Others were long and drawn out, filled with an agonizing despair that resonated deep within her soul. Yet, through it all, there was no sound, no vibration in the air, only the chilling echo within her own mind. Eleanor started keeping a journal, meticulously documenting each instance of the unheard screams, hoping to find a pattern, a trigger, something that would offer a logical explanation. She noted the time, the location within the house, her emotional state at the time. But the entries remained frustratingly random, offering no discernible cause or connection. The unknown nature of the screams tapped into a primal fear, the dread of something unseen and incomprehensible. Her attempts to find a rational explanation only led her deeper into a labyrinth of anxiety. She checked for carbon monoxide leaks, consulted online forums about tinnitus and auditory hallucinations, even contacted a local paranormal investigator who, after a cursory examination, declared the house remarkably quiet. Each failed attempt to ground her experience in reality chipped away at her sense of control, leaving her feeling increasingly vulnerable to the silent torment. The house began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a prison, its silence a suffocating blanket that amplified the internal chaos. Eleanor found herself constantly scanning the shadows, her senses hyper-alert for any sign of the unseen source of the screams. She started sleeping with the lights on, the familiar glow offering a small measure of comfort against the encroaching darkness and the silent horrors it seemed to conceal. One evening, while poring over old photographs she had found in the attic, a particular image caught her eye. It was a picture of a young woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with a silent terror that mirrored Eleanor's own. The woman stood in the doorway of what looked like the very room Eleanor now occupied. On the back of the photograph, a single word was scrawled in faded ink, "Unheard." A chill deeper than the autumn night air ran down Eleanor's spine. The photograph served as a subtle hint, a breadcrumb leading her down a darker path, suggesting a history to the house that she had been unaware of. Driven by a newfound sense of urgency, Eleanor began researching the history of the house. Local archives yielded fragmented records, whispers of a tragedy that had occurred decades ago. A young woman, driven to despair, who had allegedly taken her own life within these very walls. The details were vague, shrouded in local lore and hushed whispers, but the underlying sense of sorrow and suffering resonated with the silent screams that echoed in Eleanor's mind. 13. Could the screams be a residual echo of that past trauma, a psychic imprint left behind by the young woman's final moments of terror? Psychological horror often explores how past traumas can manifest in unsettling ways, haunting both individuals and the spaces they inhabit. The thought sent a shiver of dread through Eleanor, but it also offered a potential explanation, a tangible source for the intangible horror. As Eleanor delved deeper into the history, the silent screams seemed to intensify, as if the house itself was resisting her inquiries. She would wake in the dead of night, the silent screams pounding in her head with an almost unbearable force, accompanied by a suffocating feeling of despair that was not her own. It was as if she was experiencing the young woman's final moments, trapped in a silent echo of her terror. The line between Eleanor's own reality and the tragic past of the house began to blur. She started having vivid nightmares, not of her own loss, but of a young woman trapped and desperate, her silent screams a constant plea for release. The dreams felt disturbingly real, filled with sensory details that she couldn't have consciously imagined, further questioning her grasp on what was real and what was not. One afternoon, while exploring the overgrown garden, Eleanor stumbled upon a small weathered stone marker, half hidden beneath a tangle of ivy. Carved into the stone were the initials E.M. and a date from the early 1930s. A wave of chilling certainty washed over her. This was the grave of the young woman from the photograph. As she traced the faded letters with her fingers, a particularly intense wave of silent screaming crashed through her mind, accompanied by a vision of the young woman standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with an unbearable sadness. In that moment, Eleanor understood. The invisible screams were not just an echo of past trauma. They were a manifestation of the young woman's unresolved pain, somehow trapped within the fabric of the house, and Eleanor, in her own grief and vulnerability, had become a conduit for that suffering. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The monster wasn't an external entity. It was a lingering wound, a silent scream trapped in time. But the revelation brought with it a new, more disturbing understanding. The young woman's initial silent screams of despair had, over time, twisted into something darker, something more malevolent. The prolonged suffering, the lack of release, had corrupted the echo, turning it into a silent scream of rage and resentment. And Eleanor, now so deeply connected to this residual pain, was becoming the target of that unseen fury. The silent screams began to feel accusatory, filled with a bitterness that chilled Eleanor to her core. She felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that the house, once a potential sanctuary, was now turning against her, fueled by the amplified pain of its past. The atmosphere of dread intensified, the silence before the screams growing heavier, more threatening. One night, Eleanor woke to an absolute absence of sensation. The familiar pressure in her ears was gone. The silent screams had vanished. For a moment, she felt a surge of relief, a fragile hope that the torment had finally ended. But then, a new sensation began to creep in, a feeling of utter emptiness, a void where the screams had once been. This absence was far more terrifying than the presence of the unheard echoes. 3. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Panic began to set in as she realized she couldn't speak, couldn't even make a sound. Her own screams were now invisible, trapped within her own body, mirroring the silent torment she had been experiencing. The twist was complete. The house hadn't just echoed the screams of the past. It had absorbed Eleanor's own voice, her own ability to express her terror, leaving her trapped in a silent nightmare of her own. The unheard echoes had found a new vessel, and the silence of the house was no longer just a prelude. It was the sound of her own voiceless terror, forever trapped within its walls.